Getting a clearer picture of the timeline related to the death of Oscar winner Gene Hackman.
They say he died from heart disease after his wife passed away from a rare infectious illness.
The FBI opened a tunnel beneath Gene Hackman's property. That part is confirmed. What they found inside has barely been spoken about publicly. And the reason for that silence is the thing you click to understand. Because when federal agents reached the bottom of that passage, they encountered something that didn't fit any ordinary explanation for why a man builds a hidden underground structure beneath his private library. There were artifacts, documents, symbols on the walls. There was a chamber no one was supposed to find. And at the far end of that chamber, there was one specific detail, one single thing, that investigators have refused to fully describe on record. Everything else in this story is context. That detail is the point. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the FBI is still not talking.
Totally separate areas. No, it's strange.
The morning. Everything broke open. February 26th, 2025. Late morning. A line of federal vehicles rolled up a private road outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, and stopped at a set of reinforced gates most people didn't even know existed. Behind those gates sat the compound that Gene Hackman had called home for years. And for days, no one had heard from it. No answered calls, no movement from staff, no sign of life from a property known for exactly two things: privacy and control. The alarm didn't come from family, it came from a handyman. He told authorities he believed the couple were dead inside. Deputies had to force their way in. Locks were cut, gates were breached. And here's why that detail matters more than it sounds. This was not the kind of property left open by accident. Everything about it, the fencing, the cameras, the layered access protocols, had been engineered to stay sealed unless someone on the inside chose otherwise. The compound didn't fail. It was simply no longer being maintained by the man who ran it. When officers entered, they expected tragedy. What they found didn't feel ordinary.
Now with new details on the investigation to the death of actor Gene Hackman, including newly released video.
Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, were discovered dead inside the mansion. Their dog was still there. Early findings suggested Betsy had died roughly a week before Gene. Her death was attributed to severe viral illness, his heart failure, with contributing factors. On paper, that should have been the end of it, natural causes, move on. But the scene told a different story, and so did the timeline. Betsy died first. A week passed. Gene, 95 years old, remained alive in that house beside her body. No call for help, no message to the outside world, no attempt to reach anyone. A man in his 90s, alone in a sealed compound, with death already inside, and he stayed quiet for 7 days. What keeps a man silent like that? Authorities confirmed no signs of foul play, and in the same breath, described the property as suspicious enough to justify a full forensic search. That contradiction matters, because once investigators widened their search, they found something concealed behind the walls of Hackman's private library, a hidden entrance, and beneath the mansion, a world no one was supposed to see. A house built to keep secrets. To understand what agents found underground, you first have to understand the house above it. Because this was never just a celebrity retreat. The Hackman estate was built like a sanctuary inside a fortress. Forest pressed in from every direction. Perimeter walls rose high enough to make the property invisible from the road. Motion sensors covered every access point. Cameras monitored the grounds day and night. Feeds routed to an internal system that could be watched from multiple rooms. Gene Hackman could see every inch of his perimeter without leaving his chair. Everything about the property communicated the same message: distance, silence, containment. And get this, even the people allowed inside that world seemed to disappear into it. Staff were carefully chosen, tightly controlled, and legally bound through agreements that went well, beyond standard employment contracts. Workers came and went over the years without saying a meaningful word publicly about what happened behind those walls. That kind of silence doesn't maintain itself. Someone made sure of it. And that someone was Gene Hackman. The interior was said to be extraordinary. Antique furniture, fine art collected across decades, rare heirlooms arranged with precision, gardens filled with unusual botanical specimens. Beautiful, yes, but beauty was only half the design. According to later assessments, the estate felt less like a home than a museum operating under military logic. Lavish on the surface, layered underneath with security infrastructure that made very little sense, unless something specific needed to remain hidden. That impression deepened when body camera footage from the initial response began circulating in investigative circles. Here's what they found when they walked through.
House. Yeah, that's a big dog right there. Right there.
Is he back inside?
Yeah.
The German Shepherd?
Furniture shifted from its usual positions. Shelves disturbed. Books replaced incorrectly. Spines misaligned in ways that suggested they had been pulled out and hastily returned. Drawers standing open across multiple rooms. A safe in one of the bedrooms. Open and completely empty. Somebody had either been searching for something or making absolutely certain it would not be found. Two possibilities, neither of them comfortable. If you want to be here when the next piece of this story breaks, subscribe now. This one is still developing, and then agents entered the library, and the case changed shape entirely. The hidden descent. The entrance was concealed with engineering, not theater. This was not a swinging bookcase, not an obvious trap door. It was built so cleanly into the architecture of the room that someone could have stood in that library for years, for decades, and never suspected anything existed beneath their feet. It required a specific sequence to open. Whoever designed it wasn't aiming for drama. They were aiming for permanent invisibility. Behind the entrance, a narrow passage, stone steps, darkness, no light, no airflow, just a steep descent into cold underground silence. And here's where it gets strange. As agents moved down, the air changed. Damp, metallic, heavy. The kind of heavy that tells you a space hasn't been properly ventilated in a very long time. Their light swept across the walls, and what came into view didn't ease anything. The surfaces were marked, not random scratches, deliberate carvings, planned inscriptions, symbols cut with intent into the stone, some resembling alchemical notation from early scientific and esoteric traditions. Others looked more technical, closer to engineering diagrams, rendered in a style that didn't map cleanly onto any single era or discipline. One section of wall appeared to show a machine rendered in components, gears, channels, chambers aligned with what investigators described as unnatural precision for something cut by hand into bare stone. Here's the catch, and this is the part that changes everything. The deeper the team went, the older the structure appeared to become. Near the entrance, later reinforcement, industrial-grade concrete, mid-century stabilization. But lower down, the walls roughened. Tool marks changed character, the marks of people working without modern equipment, taking their time, cutting by hand. The upper passage had been renovated. The core beneath it was ancient. Gene Hackman did not build this tunnel. He inherited it. Someone had been down here long before he arrived, and he had spent years, maybe decades, making sure whatever they left behind stayed exactly where it was. What he found at the bottom of those steps is the reason this story refuses to close. The chamber, a vast space buried under the house, frozen in its own logic. Old wooden crates lined the walls. Some had collapsed with age, their contents spilling into the dust. Documents, metal objects, unidentified artifacts, fragments of a collection that appeared in no estate inventory ever publicly filed for Gene Hackman or anyone associated with the property. There were photographs, fragile, curling, sepia-toned, faces with no names, meetings in windowless rooms, underground locations that didn't match anything on any public record. In one image, men stood around a table scattered with maps beneath a single overhead lamp. On the back of that photograph, a date, 1937. And a single word no one involved in the investigation has been willing to identify publicly. Bound files nearby. Pages filled with dates, coded references, missing names, partial burn damage. Someone had tried to destroy sections of this material and hadn't finished the job. Insignias tied to organizations either long dissolved or erased from any ordinary historical record. And get this. On the far wall of the chamber, agents found the thing that stopped everyone cold. An iron door set deep into the stone. No exterior handle, no visible mechanism, no access point on the side facing the chamber. Welds running along the frame edges. Corrosion settled into the seams. The steel had been fused shut from inside. That is the one detail this entire story turns on. That is the detail the FBI opened a tunnel to find. And that is the detail that cannot be explained away. If a door is locked from the outside, the meaning is simple. Keep people out. Standard security logic. But when a door is sealed from within, the question changes completely. Something went through that door and sealed it from the other side. Whether to protect what was behind it or to protect whoever remained on this side of it is a question no public statement has yet answered. Officially, authorities have said almost nothing about what lies beyond that wall. In a case tied to the death of one of Hollywood's most celebrated actors, that silence is not normal. Cases like this leak, fragments emerge, sources talk. Here, almost nothing did. The chamber floor wasn't bare stone. It was marked. Large circular engravings spread across the ground, intricate and deliberate. Viewed from above, they resembled astronomical layouts, constellation maps, planetary alignment charts, precise, purposeful. Arranged by someone who understood exactly what they were recording. The recovered objects deepened that impression further, tools and devices unlike anything easily categorized. Engravings with no known manufacturing signature. Internal mechanisms of such precision that investigators describe them as inconsistent with the apparent age of the space surrounding them. One small metal cylinder reportedly contained rotating rings with no visible method of external assembly. No one could explain it. No one could place it in any known tradition of manufacture. At that point, the chamber stopped looking like an archive. It started looking like a preserve system, a place where documents, symbols, machinery, and carefully maintained secrecy converged around whatever was behind the iron barrier. And the man who had lived above all of it for years, he knew. He had always known. The ghost line. Here's something that didn't make it into any public briefing.
Yeah, well, investigators say that they have most of the major answers, but they are still considering this an open investigation.
Among the recovered materials were documents that forensic analysts described as coded, not encrypted in any modern technical sense, but written in systems of notation requiring specialist interpretation. Dates without context, references without subjects, names removed, in some cases cleanly excised, in others chemically treated to render them illegible. Someone had worked through these files with patience and purpose, stripping out the most identifying elements while leaving the underlying structure intact. Records of something. Of what, the ongoing assessment has not disclosed. But here's what investigators could establish. The documents spanned eras. Paper stock, ink formulations, binding materials, all suggesting accumulation across multiple decades, maybe longer. This was not a collection assembled by one person in one period of time. It had been added to, curated, maintained as a living archive, not a static one. Which means whoever was responsible for this chamber had not simply inherited it. They had actively participated in it. And there's something else. Mixed among the older materials were items that didn't fit the timeline. Objects whose construction suggested manufacture far more recent than the apparent age of the space around them. Whether those items had been carried down through the concealed entrance recently, or whether they represented something else entirely, investigators haven't said. What the chamber made clear was this. Whatever had been housed there had not been sitting untouched for decades while the world moved on. It had been active. During later renovation work, investigators found one more piece, an older closed-circuit communication line linking the house, directly to the underground chamber. Not standard telecom infrastructure, not ordinary residential wiring, a private channel hidden behind the walls of an already heavily secured estate. Investigators called it a ghost line, if it was still functional at the time of the deaths. And there is reason to believe it was. Then someone had not merely preserved the underground system, someone had been using it, which brings everything back to the question at the center of all of this. What exactly was Gene Hackman guarding down there? And how long had he been doing it? Because the ghost line wasn't incidental. In a house already wired with external cameras, motion sensors, and a multi-room internal monitoring system, a private underground communication channel is not an oversight. It is deliberate infrastructure. Someone ran that line because they needed it. And the fact that it was still there, hidden, functional, routed through walls that had been renovated multiple times, without disturbing it, suggests that every person who worked on this property across the decades had been instructed, explicitly, to leave it alone. That is not how ordinary construction works. That is how a secret is maintained across generations of labor. There were other details from the property's history that had gone unremarked until now. Neighbors in the surrounding area described low-frequency vibrations at night, something mechanical, rhythmic, felt in the chest more than heard through the ears. One resident reportedly raised the subject with Hackman directly and received only a quiet response. Some things are better left below the surface. Then came the stranger pieces. Unmarked vehicles arriving after dark on multiple occasions over the years. Former staff disappearing from ordinary social view. Not dramatically, but completely. The way people disappear when they've signed something airtight and intend to honor every word of it. A former housekeeper allegedly told someone she had seen things inside the house she was never meant to see. She vanished from the social orbit around the property not long after. Gene Hackman presided over all of it. The silence was his. The management was his. Every decision about who got close and who got warned off flowed from one man living above a sealed underground system that had been in place, in some form, since long before he arrived. The weight of what he knew. Think about what it means to inherit something you didn't choose. Not a house, not a fortune. Something that came with the property and couldn't be returned or disclosed or quietly left behind. Something that required your active participation in its concealment year after year, decade after decade, until the day you died. Think about what that does to a man, what it costs him, what it makes him build around himself just to keep the outside world from getting close enough to ask the wrong question. That is what Gene Hackman's life looked like. Once investigators mapped the security infrastructure across its full timeline. And here's what nobody expected. The security of this property had not been designed by one person with one purpose. It had been designed by multiple people across multiple periods, each adding to what came before, each operating from the same underlying logic. This place must stay sealed. Whatever is here must stay unknown. Gene Hackman had not created that principle. He had inherited it. And somewhere along the way, maybe the day he first found the entrance in the library, maybe years earlier, maybe the very first time he walked down those stone steps into the dark, he had made the decision to honor it. The oldest components of the estate's security appeared to date back to the mid-20th century. The newest were recent and digital. Generation after generation of people had maintained this secret, handing it forward like a debt.
It is the newly released body cam video showing cops arriving at the Santa Fe home of
Gene Hackman was simply the last one left to carry it. Here's what that geographic context adds. Santa Fe is known for art, for wealth, for the kind of privacy that high desert money buys. But the land around it has another history that doesn't get discussed at cocktail parties. Los Alamos is not far away. The birthplace of the atomic bomb sits within easy driving distance of the Hackman estate. Cold War infrastructure, classified testing, underground research facilities, and black budget programs all took physical shape in this region during the middle decades of the 20th century. Northern New Mexico has long been a place where secrecy doesn't just exist as policy. It takes physical form in the ground itself. If the lower sections of the tunnel were genuinely ancient, and the upper sections were reinforced with materials consistent with mid-century classified installations, and the iron door was constructed using techniques associated with hardened government infrastructure of that era, then the passage beneath the library begins to look less like a private eccentricity and more like a component of something much larger. Maybe an old spur from a network that no longer officially exists. Maybe a forgotten chamber that later classified programs absorbed and adapted. Maybe something discovered rather than built, incorporated into infrastructure that came after. Gene Hackman lived at the intersection of all of it. A man of enormous public accomplishment, maintaining in complete secrecy a private obligation that had nothing to do with Hollywood and everything to do with whatever had been buried beneath that library before he was born. That decision and what it cost him is not something any forensic investigation can fully recover, but it shapes everything about what happened in his final days. The week of silence. Officially, Gene Hackman died of heart failure at 95. That remains the public record. On paper, it remains plausible. Official plausibility is not the same thing as a complete story. It doesn't explain the isolation. It doesn't explain why the internal cameras inside the mansion had been disabled. It doesn't explain the open safe, the disturbed library, or the evidence that the hidden mechanism leading to the tunnel.
He's probably a little sad. You okay? You okay? Yeah, he's running around.
Had been recently activated, not long before the deaths were discovered. That last detail. Sit with it. Gene Hackman, in the final stretch of his life, went down those stone steps again, into the dark, into the damp, into the chamber below the house he had spent decades protecting. He activated the mechanism, he made the descent. And whatever he found at the bottom, or whatever he went down to confirm, he never told anyone. Why? To check something, to retrieve something, to confirm that the iron door was still holding, or to confirm it was no longer holding at all. Every one of those possibilities means something different. None of them are comfortable. And get this, the people who knew Hackman in Santa Fe did not describe a cold man. They described warmth, routine, someone who engaged genuinely with the people around him, who showed up in small ways that mattered. He was not the kind of person who withdrew because he hated people. Maybe he withdrew because he believed he had to. Because the walls and the gates and the cameras and the NDAs and the disappearing staff were not the actions of a man protecting fame. They were the actions of a man managing a burden that had come with the property, one that required constant, careful, expensive silence to contain. This is where the final week becomes almost unbearable to think about directly. A man of 95, his wife Betsy gone, dead in the house around him, her absence filling every room. Cameras disabled, the compound sealed from inside, something beneath the library still unresolved, and the quiet awareness that the moment he called for outside help, those people would come through the door, move through the rooms, and eventually stand in the library and find exactly what he had spent his life making sure they never found. If he stayed silent, maybe he was protecting it. If he moved through the house in those final days, maybe he was trying to decide whether it could still be protected at all, whether that was even the right call anymore, whether whatever was behind the iron door deserved to stay there, whether he was the last man who could answer that question, or whether the answer had already been taken out of his hands. What the silence means. Federal teams are still believed to be examining the materials recovered from beneath the estate: paper, metal, markings, residues, symbols, photographs, coded references spanning decades. The mix of expertise reportedly brought in to assess the collection is unusually broad. Forensics, materials analysis, cryptography, engineering history, and astronomy. Astronomy. That alone tells you something about what was found on that chamber floor. So does the absence of any meaningful public disclosure. We are well past the point where investigations like this begin to leak. Unnamed sources start talking. Details surface through the edges of official silence. Here, the lockdown around the underground discovery appears tighter than the messaging around the deaths themselves. And that distinction is not an accident. It suggests the chamber is not being treated as a historical curiosity or a celebrity's private eccentricity. It is being treated as sensitive, not in the abstract.
Michael, and this was such a mystery for investigators. We have now received a trove of new information.
Not in the bureaucratic sense, but sensitive right now. As though whatever lies beneath that library does not belong only to the past. As though it is still active, still consequential, still something that someone in authority has decided the public is not ready to know. And here's what that means for Gene Hackman. He was not simply a man who collected strange things and kept them underground. He was the final node in a chain of custody that stretched back before he was born. Someone before him had made the same choice he made, and someone before them. The iron door had been sealed before he ever set foot in that house. The ghost line had been installed before his renovation. Work reinforced the upper passage. The archive had been built, layer by layer, across eras and hands and decisions he was never part of. And yet, he became its keeper. He accepted that. He built a life around it. He maintained it with walls and silence, and the slow, grinding discipline of a man who understood that some responsibilities do not end until you do. The people around him in Santa Fe describe someone who, in his later years, carried something heavy. Not grief, not regret. Something closer to the weight of a long-held obligation, with no clear endpoint. The kind of weight that cannot be set down, only carried forward until it is no longer yours to carry. Gene Hackman carried it to the end. Now he is gone. The chain of custody is broken, and the FBI standing in a chamber 40 feet. Below a dead man's library, looking at an iron door sealed from the inside, is left holding something that was never supposed to come to the surface. They almost certainly know what is behind that door. The question is whether they will ever say. The thing about silence is that it has a cost.
He was in an advanced state of Alzheimer's, and it's quite possible that he was not aware that she was deceased.
Not just for the person maintaining it, but for everyone left behind when that person is gone. Gene Hackman spent decades absorbing that cost alone. The gates, the cameras, the NDAs, the carefully managed distance from a world he seemed, by all accounts, to genuinely like. None of that was incidental. All of it was load-bearing. The moment he was no longer there to maintain it, the structure he had built around the secret began to fail. The handyman called. The deputies cut the gates. The agents found the library. And 40 feet below, they found the one detail that this entire investigation turns on. A door sealed from the inside, still holding, still silent, in a chamber that was never supposed to be found. Whatever Gene Hackman's silence ultimately cost him, that door is still the answer to a question no one has managed to ask out loud yet. And whether Gene Hackman's silence, in the end, was the last thing he could do to protect it, or the last thing it cost him. If you want to be here when the chamber beyond the door is identified, you know what to do.